of the Center for Media Innovation at Point Park University in Pittsburgh. And we're grateful that so many of you made time to be part of this discussion today. This initiative was born out of the changes that we've all seen taking place across the Commonwealth and, of course, throughout the United States, as the journalism industry has been disrupted and as external forces have sown misinformation into our discourse, sometimes intentionally and sometimes just completely out of ignorance. I want to start out by introducing two of the people who brought together today's conversation. Helen Fallon, who's the president of the Press Club of Western Pennsylvania and professor emeritus at Carnegie University, and Jim Friedlich, who's the executive director and CEO of the Lenfest Institute. Helen, welcome.
Sure. Thanks so much, Andy. I've been thinking about getting people together across the state for quite some time: journalists, media managers, academics, journalism supporters, which we need many of those. But what happened this year is I went to teach my course that I teach every fall, it's media literacy. And, you know, my young students they're almost all freshmen. They're the varying majors in our School of Communication, and it's always been interesting. But this year in particular, what I found is they came back thinking they get their information, of course, from Facebook and Twitter, and we have to have that discussion. You know, they're a platform, not a content provider. They also don't know about a lot of the the reliable news sources. Some never heard of 60 Minutes. A couple of them didn't really know what NPR was all about.
Oh my.
And a number of them have never read the New York Times. So I have my work cut out for me, particularly this semester. What I do every year with this group is I assign them a media journal, and they have to tell me what they've accessed all week. And every week they have to find a news source, and they just report out. And it's always been eye-opening, and for them and for me. And this year, of course, we did a great deal with fake news in the very beginning. But my new textbook had something really interesting in it for this year, and I learned about something called NewsGuard. And there's a connection to that today, and I'll let Jim tell you more about that. And I added it to this fake news assignment. And then I asked the students to comment on it. And what they would do is look at what they've been accessing, compare it to where they come from. And you know, you have to look at them with their frame of reference. They learn from their parents, their peers, and it's always been very interesting. So they tried NewsGuard and they liked it. They didn't want to pay for it, which is pretty typical of this generation and my generation as well. So I told them we were kind of on the same wavelength there. But with this assignment and working through it, what they did throughout the semester was learn how to fact check. They expanded their media access, and many of them tell me that they passed that on to others. So I took that, and you know, just what we've all experienced with the presidential election, the fight in our state courts here in Pennsylvania over claims of fraud, and then January 6th. The need to call people together became, just to me, more important than ever. And I started reaching out to Melinda, whom I know, and Teresa at PNA, found Lenfest through Andy. Andy and I talk all the time, you know, all these people, and then we reached out to Luttrell at Thomas Jefferson University. And we all agreed that there was something really important to do, that we have to take a look at it and just see this. It just keeps continuing. So, you know, we're here today, and we're going to get started with part one and listen to Dr. Carley and her research, because as I tell students all the time, we don't take action until we do some research and we learn something. And even at my older age, I feel as if I'm learning all the time. And this is our setting for part one. Part two will be the NewsGuard report, which Jim will talk here a little bit about and explain how we're coming to that. And we want to work you all into this. It's not just what I think or what any one of us think, it's what we all think and what we know and how we can pull our resources together. And we need definitely to push back against misinformation and disinformation and all the false news sites that are coming up. And then I'd like us to think about next steps. The best part for me has been finding out about places like the Pen and Pencil Club in Philadelphia, the two news organizations, press clubs in Harrisburg that I knew a little bit about, all the professional organizations, and some very familiar people who are attending today's session. So we want you all to participate today, to listen, to learn with us, and then we'll talk about next steps. And Jim is going to tell us a little bit here, I believe, next before we get to Dr. Carley.
Thank you.
To you, Jim.
Can you hear me okay? I'm in my son's bedroom, and
The Wi-Fi doesn't always work, but it's great to be here. I wanted to just briefly tell you about next week. At this time next week, which is Tuesday the 16th at noon, we're going to ask the leaders of a group called NewsGuard to present a study that we commissioned of information and misinformation in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And I wanted to tell you briefly about NewsGuard and kind of top line what we've heard from them about their study. And then hopefully as many as possible will be back. NewsGuard is a nonpartisan business. It's a for-profit business. It was started by the former Wall Street Journal publisher, Gordon Krovitz, and his colleague, Steve Brill, who had also started Court TV and the New York Law Review and other publications. So there are two veteran news people who are extremely concerned about the veracity and independence of news in America. What they did was hire about 75 journalists to look at, as human beings, to look at and analyze news sites across the United States and rate them. And they rate them based upon whether they disclose their ownership, whether they have a clear separation between advertising and editorial, whether they make clear what is opinion and what is proper news coverage, whether they conflate advocacy with news content, whether they disclose their ownership at all. And there's a point system, a kind of trust measurement system. Almost all the publications represented on this call and in the roster rate very high, as they should. And they rate them with a point system, but they assign them a green light, an amber light, or a red light, depending upon that. And so Fox News and CNN both have amber lights because they conflate opinion and news and don't always make clear where one begins and the other one ends. Really straight up bad news, fake news sites that masquerade as news content, that have news content like names, but are paid for by a PAC or a pharmaceutical company, from the right, from the left, irrespective, get a red light. And this has become a kind of standard rating system to know what is out there. And we wanted to do a health check on the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. What we've found from NewsGuard, and they'll provide all the details about this, is that of 180 sites that they measured in the state, they've identified 50 that are straight up red sites from both the left and the right, mainly paid for by PACs, showing up as news sites, but pushing a particular candidate or dissing a particular candidate, depending upon their orientation. They also measured if news is consumed in the state of Pennsylvania, not just sites based in Pennsylvania, but news about Pennsylvania that mentions the word Pennsylvania over a 1-year period, and there's been a lot of it. How much of that traffic and how many of those sites are red sites? And it turns out it's about 13% of the sites that cover the state, mainly electoral politics, and 26% of the traffic, which is a fancy way of saying that bad news and fake news has much more virality than legitimate news. It's more entertaining, it's more shareable. Bad news travels fast. So we'll disclose all of this next Monday. Yossi Lichterman, my colleague who's on the phone, will send all of you the report in advance if you want to report on it, if you just want to consume it and ask questions about it on Monday. And then we can talk about it on Tuesday. And I think some of it is newsworthy. Much of it, if not all of it, is just good to know about if you're in the legitimate news business, as we all are. The last thing is they will have tips and best practices about how best to define and disclose your policies on editorial separation and independence and ownership and all that to increase trust. So they'll leave you with a kind of how-to, some of which is second nature, some of which was news to me. So you'll learn something about best practices as well. So with that, I wanted to thank Andy for inviting us into the tent, the indefatigable Helen Fallon for putting all this together, and I'm really eager to hear from Dr. Carley.
Okay. Thank you, Jim and Helen. It's nice to see so many familiar names and faces from across the state, but also new ones to me anyway. And it's not often that we're able to get together like this statewide, and we've actually got a few people from outside of the state as well. We're fortunate today to be able to kick off this conversation with Dr. Kathleen Carley, who will be able to present an overview for us about the problems with disinformation. And then after she talks for about 15 minutes, we're going to go into breakout rooms and have a chance to talk with each other and make this more interactive and report back what we're all thinking about it. Dr. Carley is a professor at Carnegie Mellon University's Institute for Software Research, and she's director of the Center for Informed Democracy and Social Cybersecurity. Her center is a Knight-funded initiative that was launched in 2019, and she studies disinformation, hate speech, and extremism online. And they also research how to detect these things, how they spread, and how to counter their impact. While she's talking, I suggest that you use the chat function to submit questions and comments. And then when she's done, we'll have a few minutes to do a short Q&A, and then we'll go into our breakout rooms. Dr. Carley?
Okay, thank you for having me. Let me share my screen. Okay, so first off, thank you all for having me, and I want to talk to you a little bit about what we've learned through our research about disinformation, misinformation, and social media. When I use the term disinformation, we mean that information which is known to be inaccurate and the people who send it know that it is, whereas misinformation would be the information that is inaccurate. The people sending it don't necessarily know. Disinformation, of course, is nothing new. Disinformation has always been with us, but when Ramses II tried to tell people that he won a victory, which in fact he did not, it took lots of money and it required putting things in bas relief on these big obelisks. Today, disinformation is spread with low cost through the internet, leading to and spreads much further, such as the story that Bill Gates actually invented the coronavirus, caused it to be spread so the world would go cashless, so that people could use the 5G towers to control you when they injected you with the vaccine and an RFID chip at the same time. Leading, of course, to some of the problems we're having today with the rollout of the modern vaccine. The thing about disinformation is it's very easy to think that what that means is simply fact checking will solve it. The disinformation is just inaccurate facts. In point of fact, there are many, many, many different kinds of disinformation. Some of it is very unambiguous. It's relatively easy to identify, such as the doctored image you see there of the megastorm, which occurs in every single disaster that involves a storm. Just place your favorite picture of your current landmark in front of it, and voila, you have the megastorm in your city, your state, your country. To the harder to identify deep fakes, but those are still going to be relatively easy to identify because they're machine generated, compared to the kinds of disinformation that is really difficult and pervades society, which is basically information that is taken out of temporal context or out of content context, or that is spread through misleading anecdotes. For example, one of the strongest arguments made for anti-vaccination is, my girlfriend did not get her kids vaccinated and they do not have autism. It implies that you can get autism by getting vaccinated. The statement itself could be 100% true, but it is extremely hard to refute or to argue against such kinds of information. The reason disinformation spreads so fast is because of the way social media is organized. Regardless of whether you're on Facebook or Reddit or Twitter or whatever, it's organized into a series of topic-oriented communities. These topic groups are a set of actors who come and go, who more or less talk about the same thing. An example is plane spotters, which is people who like to talk about the planes they see in the air. Another example are those people who talk about Meghan Markle all the time. Another group shows up every time there's a Super Bowl, and so on. But these topic groups can take on a pathological form called the echo chamber. And in the echo chamber, that is where disinformation is spread, and it becomes the hotbed for the spread of disinformation, as well as hate speech, as well as extremism. And we'll see in a few seconds how echo chambers work. In spreading disinformation, the people who are trying to spread it, the groups that are trying to spread it, are taking advantage of three things. One, the way the technologies themselves work. Two, the way your mind works. And three, the way people understand the world in terms of social cognition. On the technology itself, every single technology has rules in it, algorithms, for prioritizing messages, for prioritizing topics, for recommending stuff to you. These algorithms can be figured out through gaming, and you can get messages or people that you want prioritized. You can also then send your messages in such a way to confirm people's prior biases, or you can do it through making it appear that everybody agrees, which then builds off of people's notion of sense of self, moral values, and their social world they live in. In social media, it's easy to think about disinformation as being all about content. After all, most disinformation stories are told as stories. However, it's not just the narrative that can be manipulated, it's also the community itself. One of the things that people who are engaged in these influence campaigns are doing when they're manipulating things is they're actually shaping who the opinion leaders are in social media, what the groups are, and what the apparent groups are linked to what other groups. A successful influence campaign that will spread disinformation will take a group of individuals who more or less interact, like as seen in the top left here. They will then, and who are more or less talking about the same thing. And so you've got this kind of meandering, wandering conversation, just like you would normally see in people's conversations. But the influence campaign will actually build more linkages among the individuals. They will build more linkages among the topics, and they will focus the attention of the individuals on one topic in particular, in this case, RU. That kind of focusing is a way of building an echo chamber. And when you build an echo chamber, the individuals within it are primed to start responding to things emotionally rather than rationally, to tell stories rather than relying on facts, to circle the wagons and not let in outsiders. And they build this internal sense of belonging and comfort that, they have something special within their group. In science, what we have come up with is new ways of actually understanding and tracking disinformation. Using the BREN framework, we identify who is spreading it, whether they're super spreaders or news agencies or bots or trolls. The kind of information maneuvers that they use to do this, such as enhance and explain and distort campaigns, who it's being aimed at, whether it's being aimed at a particular community or an individual, and what does it do? Normally we often think from a public affairs or perspective that a story is as good as its reach. In point of fact, disinformation, the goal is not just reach, it's actually building an echo chamber, building polarization, building mass hysteria. And so we begin to look at that. To look at disinformation stories, I want to show you an example. This occurred when NATO was trying to create excitement around NATO itself, and they used what was called the Viking Warrior campaign. This was true, okay? This young man is actually a male model. He's also a soldier. And for NATO, this got a lot of play, right? This got a lot of reach, and it was an excite campaign. In contrast, Russia sent out a double meme that showed the defense minister of Russia, the defense ministers of Sweden, Norway, Netherlands, and Germany. The implication of this is that NATO is weak, Russia is strong, and Russia really understands the military. And the member nations of NATO do not understand the military. Much, much more play in social media, but this was basically built on a piece of disinformation. These people certainly do understand the military and so on. This was what's called a dismay campaign, and it was way cheaper to run than was the Trident Juncture one because it just involved using a couple of memes. Disinformation, of course, has been spread using memes, as well as using images, as well as using false facts during the COVID-19, to the point where there were over 7,000 at least stories about disinformation that spread during the past year. Some of this was spread through doctored images, such as the one you see here, which is spreading the idea that drink bleach to cure yourself of COVID or to prevent it, which actually led to some deaths in some country. As well as this is a dismay campaign on the right, which shows them talking about the World Health Organization and talking about how they admit that asymptomatic transmission is rare. Okay, they're not getting the story right. It's filled with lots of false information. This is one of them things that fact checkers actually was able to talk about. But these are examples of disinformation campaigns. The point is, this one is much harder to stop, the one with the bleach, than is the dismay one. The second point I want to make is that neither of them can be stopped by simply calling them out and saying they are wrong. One of the reasons for this is the way in which disinformation is spread. It's spread using tools like memes. It's spread using bots. It's spread using, which are completely automated accounts. It's spread by cyborgs, which are actors who are sometimes played by humans, sometimes by bots, by trolls, which are humans operating under pseudonyms and using hate speech to bash particular subgroups, somewhat through deep fakes, although they are not very common right now. But importantly, they're also spread by the actual wording, the images that are used that prey on people's subconscious and make them think things in certain ways. Bots are used to spread disinformation. There's many, many types of bots. And I want to emphasize, bots are not necessarily bad, and they are not the source of disinformation, but they can be used to spread it. And one way they do it is they surround super spreaders. So here's the source of information. This might be a celebrity. This might be a state actor. And they will simply spend all the time the bots do is simply retweeting out their messages. So when this actor sends out false information, there's this megaphone around them that spreads it further. In addition, when another way that bots work is you've got two different communities who may have nothing to do with each other, and the bots are actually designed to actually introduce people from the two groups to each other by using the affordances of the technology and actually build groups and build bridges between groups. This kind of bot was used very much during the 2016, 2018, and 2020 elections to actually build connections between subgroups and then prime them with information about disinformation and turn them into echo chambers. This kind of bot, the Megaphone bot, was actually has been used a lot during the COVID-19 and during the 2020 election to actually promote conspiracies and foreign state disinformation. For example, around China and Russia's state-sponsored media, there are little armies of these megaphone bots who basically are promoting out everything, all the disinformation that they're spreading, including the idea that the US invented the coronavirus, including the idea that the Pfizer vaccine doesn't work, and so on. Bots are used to retweet this information. And in general, what you find is that bots are used, about 20% of the messages you get in general come from bots. But in the disinformation area, about 40% of the disinformation is coming from bots. And if it's really lethal disinformation, like about bioweapons or about drinking things like bleach to cure yourself, about 60% of that disinformation is being retweeted and spread by bots. Disinformation, we find, also fosters hate, leading to hate groups. For example, at the beginning of the COVID-19, when last February and so on, all the red dots here actually represent individuals engaged in hate speech. The yellow dots represent people who are using abusive terms, and the blue are just regular people. And what's happening over time is bots are bringing these groups together, forming these communities, of hate speech, forming communities of abusive language. They then build connections between the abusive language people and hate speech, building larger and larger hate speech communities in the US. And then they redirect those hate speech groups using disinformation to add hate towards particular actors. And many of that during the COVID-19 has been directed toward the scientific community. With using disinformation to talk about why everything that was coming out of Fauci and others, the World Health Organization, was wrong. If we look at bots over time and look at disinformation, what we find is that when you have disinformation campaigns, one of the things that happens is you get a spike like this in the number of new accounts created. And when a whole bunch of new accounts are created all at once, some will be bots, some won't be bots, but they will be. And if they then start all tweeting at once about the same topic, as they did in the rollout of the reopen campaigns, what you do is you get these ones to start, not only you create a bunch of new accounts, you get them to all start saying the same thing. You create a very coordinated structure among these new accounts. And then with that coordinated structure, you kind of suck in and link on to other people, such as people who are upset about the economy. And then you start spreading disinformation to them through this new group that you created and set up. This was actually done during the reopen campaigns that were done. And if you look at the actors in the Open America campaigns, about 30% of the accounts on the Open America campaign, which was the one that was in North Carolina, were actually were actually bots. The Gridlock campaign in Michigan, again, about 30% of them were bots. If you look at the Pennsylvania one, about 30% of them were bots, but close to 40 to 50% of the tweets that were promoting the reopen campaign were actually coming from bots that were set up and were these kind of last minute, spike accounts that were set up. And they were actually used to pull out disinformation to actually promote the protests. So for example, the Reopen America tweets included links to conspiracy theories and disinformation. They talked about COVID-19 being a hack, being a hoax, about coronavirus being a lie, about the hospitals really being empty, and so on. They also had more standard disinformation, such as the things about masks not reducing the spread, protesting, arguing that protests were much bigger than they really were, than that the World Health Organization had lied. Disinformation was spread because of a pattern of activity that occurred. All these new accounts were put open. Many of them joined the reopen side. A few joined the anti-reopen side. Those increased the size of those groups. It built connections, making them more echo chamber-like. They then sent out excite messages on one side, dismay messages on the other side. Often both of those would be based on disinformation. They then backed certain opinion leaders on both sides, and they tried to engage the groups, making the groups more and more and more emotional, and therefore less likely to think critically about the information, whether or not it was true or false. And that then, of course, led to some of the protests that we actually saw. And we saw this happen over and again in Michigan, Carolina, Pennsylvania, and so on. Why do people spread disinformation? Many reasons. For fun, because they're bored. This picture here is some kids just at a concert saying, hey, we lost my little brother. This was a kid for autism, was not even that age when this picture was sent out. They were just bored. You also have people doing it intentionally to attack various ethnic minority groups, to disrupt civil society, and to foster various political agendas. Lots and lots of different information. It's not just about money, although understanding who is paying for this sometimes can help. In terms of the reach in terms of what causes disinformation to spread, if you have a celebrity re-reporting it, if a major news outlet that is known to be credible re-reports it, if you have megaphone bots, if you have coordination of the same message across multiple platforms like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube all at the same time, all of those things can increase the reach of the disinformation. In particular, content moderation was thought to be able to help it. In point of fact, what we know is that content moderation backfires. Often, and particularly if you try to moderate a celebrity, it actually causes more people to go and read the disinformation and to repost it. So, and the other thing is disinformation that is consistent already with your worldview will actually last longer and be harder to stop. So in terms to combat it, it is still the case that calling out disinformation can help. It also helps to just simply not spread it. One of the reasons a lot of the disinformation during coronavirus spread so far was because people thought it was funny and they spread it, but the people who read their posts didn't realize they were saying that it was just funny. Of course, checking credible sites is important. Surrounding yourself with known news bots that are actually sending valuable information, and taking breaks from social media. All companies should set up a social cybersecurity team to establish a trusted presence, monitor monitor for brand jacking, counter disinformation, and to educate their personnel. In particular, as journalists, the things I would be looking for is to monitor fact-checking sites, to monitor these state-sponsored medias, particularly Saudi Arabia, Russia, and China. Also, the low credibility sites, such as the ones that NewsGuard and other have found. And to look for surges in account creation, to look for inconsistencies in messages, such as typos, slight changes in names, changes in images, things like that. Sock puppets where they don't actually have an image. A lot of those kinds of accounts are sources of disinformation. And then again, looking for influence campaigns that are, look for the places they're going to target. They're going to target racial groups. They're going to target women. They're going to target the LGBTQ community. They're going to target opposing political parties. Those are the common groups that are currently targeted within the United States, within Pennsylvania, and within Western Europe. So with that, this is who I am, and please feel free to reach out to me with additional questions and issues.
Thank you, Dr. Carley. I appreciate that. We'll take questions now, a few questions just to get the conversation going and to clarify her presentation. So you can either post them in the chat or you raise your hand and you can go from there, or just unmute and ask your question. I'll kick it off and then open it up to the group. Dr. Carley, since you're talking to a group of journalists, I mean, you talked about some things, specific things we can do, but what do you think is the role of journalism in combating both misinformation and disinformation? These are people we've all dedicated our lives to, ferreting out the truth and telling it, broadcasting it, publishing it to people. What role do you think that we have to play in that?
Actually a lot. One is that you have a role to make sure that you maintain a trusted presence, so that if you know that you accidentally publish something, to have credible, you have your own credible fact checking to have good editorial practices. And when you've published something that's incorrect, to, stand up, say, hey, yeah, back off from it. But the other thing I think is a certain type of outreach, and that is sharing with the community at large and so on, the kinds of sites and sources that you find that are themselves spreading disinformation. And to be and also even-handedness. Disinformation is not, this is not just a Russia phenomenon. It's not just a Chinese phenomena. It's not just a Republican, just a Democratic. It's kind of coming from all over the place. So an even-handedness with respect to it and voicing it in non-emotional terms are all important kind of ways of helping stop the spread of disinformation.
Great, thank you. One of the participants in the chat asked if you would take down the sharing so we can see each other. And then somebody else asked, sort of I guess a technical question. Kent Jackson asked, how do you find out if a surge of accounts has been created? Which I think is, maybe even a broader question for, the general information journalists who, many of us are. How technically savvy do we have to be, and are there certain places we should be, looking for these sorts of things?
So to find the surge of accounts, one is that on most of the platforms, when you look at an account, it has a creation date. Okay, and if you're collecting data around a particular issue, just look at the creation date for the different accounts who are like the main speakers, the ones who send out a lot of messages. That would be one way of doing it. The other part of this is that there's a growing number of tools in this space. I know one of the things we do at Carnegie Mellon is we create new technologies, and we're happy to also talk about how we can make those available to journalists as well.
Yeah, Dr. Moretti at Robert Morris raises the issue that news organizations, we're asking news organizations to do more of this type of work at the same time they're losing resources. How do we balance that?
Oh, it's going. How are you?
Pretty good. So I think one of the critical things there is to work with the technologists, to work with people like us, so that we can kind of figure out what can be automated to give you more time to think and do the things that really require humans to track down. because it is true. Like you said, if you've got fewer staff, you can't do as much, but maybe you can work smarter by utilizing things that do some of the drudge work for you.
Yeah, for sure. Dr. Crittenden at Thomas Jefferson University raises the issue of news deserts, which, we're talking about what can journalists do, but it brings up this whole issue of, what happens when you're in a community where there are no professional journalists. And I know from my own research, these are places where the misinformation can just spread like wildfire. Do you have any suggestions for places like that? How do we get citizens more involved in that?
Yeah, so this is a really, I think this is a growing and really hard problem. We often refer to the kinds of, there's been an increase in what we call pink slime sites, which is a colorful term for these little papers that start to come out in these news deserts that look like they're school newspapers or local community ones, but are actually coming from lots of different places and that are spreading the disinformation. And, how do we stop them? I would say we don't have a good idea. Nobody knows for sure. But one possibility is if we could just start getting more education about critical thinking, about understanding your community into the classroom, even in grade school, would begin to help.
Yeah. Let's take one more question for the breakout rooms. Heather, you've raised your hand.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder how much you have studied a trend that I have been studying with my partner, Walter, in our work at Root Quarterly around the media, which is this tendency of legacy media to kind of otherize and denigrate new media, like podcasts and other things like that are often long form, unedited. I tend to go to those as sources of information much more than mainstream news, which I've pretty much had it with at this point. I'm a little concerned even that the algorithms on YouTube and things like that now are pointing people toward things like CNN or CBS News when they're being discredited all the time for misreporting things or overhyping things like the Capitol riots. So I just wonder where you are on your research with that. Is it a trend that you're looking for? Because people are definitely looking for good information and they can't find it. And if we're pointing people to legacy news organizations that are not doing a good job of reporting, whether that's because of political bias or lack of newsroom reporters anymore, where do people go?
So we have not been studying that per se. I know that one of my students actually created podcasts, but I would say we're more on the end of encouraging those kinds of things, but we're not studying them per se.
Okay, well, thanks. Because we don't want this just to be a one-way conversation, we decided to have breakout rooms. And so we're gonna now send everybody off into a breakout room. We're gonna ask is that you have that conversation for about 15 minutes, that somebody in the room takes some notes. You're all reporters, take some good notes so you can report out to the group afterwards. We can have a conversation about what you discussed in your group. But when you're in your group, think about, what are some of the things that, ways you've encountered these problems of misinformation and disinformation, and what role journalists can play in combating them. What you talked about in your group.
But before you start, Kim, maybe we could go by the number in the breakout. How many breakout rooms were there, Yossi?
There were 7 breakout groups.
If you want to call them, maybe Andy, like 1 to 7.
Yeah, so we can do the 7 breakout groups, and then when you introduce yourself, if you could just say where you're from, or how you're affiliated, what brought you to the group, something like that, so we know a little bit more about you. But I think I was in group 1, right?
I think so, Andrew. I think we were in group 1.
All right. So what do you got?
Yeah, so I'm Brett Schultes at WITF in Harrisburg. I'm a health reporter. So everybody in our group had sort of a different entrance point to their interactions with disinfo and misinfo. I know Dirk mentioned that a disinformation site posted in his news agency's comments section, and it caused so much chaos. They had to silence it. And then they were concerned, that they're, silencing someone and shaping the conversation, but they had to learn to balance the fact that it was just completely derailing the conversation with false information. everybody else, Kylie mentioned that she's seen a lot of disinformation on social media and has tried to combat it using good media hygiene. She's also concerned with things like deep fakes. I mentioned, that my main interest in the series and my main concern has been the way that lawmakers and elected officials have been part of this ecosystem of disinformation, where maybe something is sourced somewhere else, it gets to their constituents share it with them, and then they are able to say, well, this is just what my constituents care about. So that's something I'm more interested in learning how to stop that cycle whenever I run into it at a press conference or so forth. And then finally, and then I won't take up too much more time, but Bill in Altoona mentioned that that whenever we saw disinformation spread last year, it seemed like the mainstream media struggled to be able to handle it and do a good job of just showing that it was not legitimate. So, and I apologize if I did not characterize what you said in the best possible way, everybody, but that was my charge, and I'll pass the torch on to the next group.
There was fake news out of our group. Yeah, it's terrible. How about group 7? We'll work our way to the middle.
Somebody speak.
I don't know what group I was in, tell you the truth.
It wasn't, PJ, no disrespect, it wasn't ours. We were group 7.
Okay.
Oh,
Obviously, we weren't paying attention. That was Chris and Trevor, Patrick, Rick, and Russ, and me, except I didn't take the notes.
Well, I think we had a good discussion, and it
We
was
did.
mostly because Trevor is a young person
Yep.
entering the profession, and he has some provocative questions about how some of us older ones deal with misinformation and decide what we're going to say, what we believe. And he shared with us how he came out of a conservative religious family, but going to college, he started reading other things. And so he wasn't just affected by the buzzwords that are thrown around, liberal or conservative. And I think that's what initiated our discussion about trying to find what you define as truth from any position.
Right. Well said.
Yeah, I also got a bunch of great feedback because what I'm working on for my senior capstone at Jefferson University is teaching media literacy to high school students. I want to go back to my high school and other schools in the Philadelphia area, and this is exactly what I wanted to talk about. So I felt like, of course, coming to here and listening to you professionals speak about it is exactly what I needed to do. But also, I was like explaining to them like how I grew up, sort of basically like parroting, whatever Ben Shapiro talking points, whatever, conservative news media was saying that day, you would probably hear it coming out of my mouth when I was, a senior in high school. And so like, they were trying to like get me to think about what my journey was and like how I can explain how I came from where I am and, are still was able to, navigate the media environment basically on my own. And you could see in the beginning how I was doing it incorrectly. And so basically like talking about my journey and the steps that I took, coming away from my faith was part of the catalyst to this. So I don't know how universal that's going to be, but definitely the questions, like, they were probing me, asking me to, like really
Hey, Trevor, don't lose your faith, man. Your parents did the best they could to raise you with some kind of belief in a higher power, whatever that might be. And you'll find that there are all sorts of beliefs out there, from Hinduism to everything else. And so just explore the world, man, and find your own truth. That's the best thing that I can tell you. And not everything my father told me was true, but a lot of times I bumped my head and said, that old man knew what he was talking about. Oh, how did he know that? And so you have in you, my father used to tell me, Chris, you have mother wit. And I know what he was talking about, but it's just your intuition, that feeling that when you go into it, you can look at it and you can use some discernment. That's people. a skill people don't have anymore. And it's getting more complicated in this media world with bots and everything else to discern what is true. But I think you have it, and you're starting to see it depending on what you see, read, and experience. And I wish you well in your worldwide experiences. Travel if you can when COVID is over. Learn something about the world, man. We all want food, shelter, and clothing, you know?
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate all your help and kind words throughout, this process so far. And I'm getting vaccinated today, so hopefully I'll be able to travel soon.
Right.
There you go. That's a story unto itself, Trevor. There you go.
How about group 6? Who was in group 6?
Okay,
us.
we were group 6.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was in group 6. I'm Susan McInerney. I'm with the Pen and Pencil Club in Philadelphia.
Okay.
We talked about a few things, but the two things I got out of the one thing was about 2 items that seemed to be insolvable. That was the conflict between excitement and dismay. That excitement and dismay. The people who stormed the Capitol were both excited and dismayed. And yet the result was that they were both doing the same thing, but they came from 2 different directions. But Dr. Carley said, but it had to do with hysteria, which is the same thing. But it's really unsolvable. And I also asked about, where does one draw the line for censorship, such as Facebook? Where is that? And that's unsolvable too, because the people who are censoring some of the Facebook content also have their own biases. And it's been proven that some of the posts on Facebook were censored by people who had their own biases. So that's also another unsolvable problem. So we dealt with unsolvable problems mostly.
Dr. Carley, is it all unsolvable, or are we gonna be able to figure it out?
I would say they're not solved yet. I would hope that we can come up with better solutions by using both education, better science, and better governance.
Group 2. Who's in group 2?
I actually don't know which group I was in, so I don't know if someone can tell me, but
4, I guess.
We were 4.
okay, thank you.
All right. Does group 4 want to go now? We'll come back to 2 then. Let them figure it out.
Sure.
All right. What about 4?
My name is Kim Palmero. I'm from Post Industrial Media and also a board member of the Press Club of Western Pennsylvania. We discussed, we started out by discussing sort of the distinction between what, say, legacy media, traditional media produces, and, well, I shouldn't just include any, independent media produces versus all the other sort of information sources that might be floating around out there. And I count among those, the things, of course, that Dr. Carley was talking about, because I find that it's fascinating, watching the conversations on social media. People do not always make the distinction between this is a news source and this isn't. This is just something that I'm picking up and I feel like I'm being informed by. So one of the questions we talked about was, how do you help people see what might be credible and independent and verified and what is not? And I think Dr. Crittenden, that was raised the really great point, of course, that is, we independent, media outlets have to establish and reestablish sort of a connection with their audience. Who is their audience? Make sure that audience is reflected, engaged. Not certainly media institutions have not been good at that and have been very bad at that. in many cases anyway. Not all, but some. I mean, but a lot of people certainly have been left out and not reflected. And so for me, that was a really great point and takeaway that I would liken it to local news, the old local newspaper model. You really just had this relationship with the community where people trusted, and that institution didn't always do well at allowing everyone to be reflecting everyone on their pages. But we can learn from that and do better. And we also discussed, there's a great book, it sounds like a great book called Shadow Network by Ann Nelson. And it talks about the rise of religion-based news sites that are, or sources of news that are coming into places, you know, where there might not be news deserts, so to speak. So those were two main things that we discussed, and we didn't solve anything yet. But I think that those are both really important points and good points.
About group 3.
Can you type that in the chat, Kim?
Oh yeah,
The name of
sure.
the book. I was in group 3 with John and PJ, Karen and Dawn. We talked about, my major takeaway from what we talked about was what happens when someone is too far gone, say, when they are, you know, no longer receptive to any kind of factual information, and how to reach them at that point. We also talked about how do news outlets maybe acknowledge an opposing viewpoint while not dwelling or giving too much oxygen to something that may be a little farther afield and when it comes to facts. Anything else that we?
Well, we talked about equivalency, I think is what you're referring to. For example, President Biden was born in eastern Pennsylvania and is from Delaware, whereas this group says, no, he's an illegal alien from outer space. And so the question is, how do you report that without giving people the sense of equivalency? One bit of information is just as important or accurate as another piece of information. How do you solve that? You know, so, and we did not solve that.
One data point is that the number of readers who come to us and say that the Associated Press is no darn good. You guys put those AP stories on your front page, and don't you realize how biased they are? Well, that's the goalposts have been shifted.
Right. It used to be the gold standard for.
Yeah.
Okay, well, in the interest of time, how about group 5?
I was in group 5. I'm Rob Amon. I'm from Triple Live. See a lot of former colleagues, so hello. I apologize for my camera not working. I don't know what is going on. So, but I was in a group with Helen, Anthony, Susan, and a mystery phone number. So we never got the 5th person. But similar to what you guys all talked about, a lot of similar discussions. Just the whole reluctance of people to kind of they believe what they want to believe, and they're willing to discuss what they believe, but they're not really willing to look at alternate points of view and these brick walls that have been built from the readers or the viewers, and how we kind of break through that. And one of the other groups mentioned about, you know, journalism reflecting the community and being a part of the community. And we also discussed that. And we had, I thought, a pretty good discussion regarding just how do you become part of the community again, and do readers and viewers really think of us as part of their community, and do journalists need to do a better job of incorporating themselves in the communities? Is it more of a one-way relationship? Is it more of a top-down relationship with the people who we're trying to serve? And I think the industry might do a good job of might help themselves by really looking at that. I think it was Anthony or Helen, I apologize, but discussed about having like almost after we get back to normal, if that ever happens, some sort of like tour of colleges and universities and tapping into the J schools and the comm schools about, furthering this discussion and talking with faculty and adjuncts and getting live, professional journalists involved as well. Kind of picking their brain a little bit and getting the discussion started also at that level.
Such an important question, how to reconnect with the community, especially when, as resources have been cut, journalists spend less time in the community now than before. So it's a challenge. So if you haven't heard from anybody in your group yet, you were in group 2. So who's left out? Who is in group 2? Was there a group 2?
There is a group 2. Jillian, are you still here? Do you want to go ahead? If not, I can take it.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yep, we're good.
Hey, sorry. Yeah, we had some technical difficulties, admittedly, so we kind of didn't get to all of the things we'd like to discuss. But we talked about some of our own experiences with disinformation. I think that my editor Russ is still on the call, which I'm sure, I wonder if he also shared it, but we in Lancaster had a had a local publication that sort of popped up under the name of just somebody's first name, and so we ended up finding out that that person who had moved into our community was actually a white nationalist who had run a podcast and out of Texas. It just was really the perfect culmination of sort of this disinformation that we're talking about today. Then someone else, Deb from our group, had asked a question right by the end that we didn't really get to dive into, but about what to do when your readership in your community is asking you why you're not covering a specific issue, and that issue is something that's spurred from either misinformation or disinformation. And I would love to hear more from everyone about how to deal with that, because that's something definitely I experience as well. Rosalind, I don't know if you also, if you had anything that I missed.
Yeah, I think that captured it. The other thing we talked about was how some disinformation campaigns are really becoming quite savvy, and it's easy to see how people can be tricked if even journalists are having to scratch their heads a bit. So yeah, it was. I guess the other thing to mention is we talked about, are there ways that journalist groups can push the platforms like Facebook and Twitter to help us fight this disinformation epidemic? And that's a tall order, but it seems like something that we might need in the future.
Gillian, may I ask you a question related to your point? How do you respond? How do you respond to a member of the community who asks, why do you not cover this on something that is completely legitimate, like issues in a particular neighborhood or issues impacting a particular church, or et cetera, et cetera? Because I think that might be an answer there into how you approach that. Yeah,
that's a great question. And I guess the answer usually is, and I'm sure that most people experience this too. The answer is resources, and that's the reason why something might be going uncovered, or even just the answer is yeah, we should be covering that. But like I got a lot of emails, and I mentioned this in our breakout group from readers sending me links from like the Epoch Times or these like known or disinformation sites, and people being like, why won't you cover this story about all of these ballots getting driven in, like things like that. So I don't know how to answer that question, but I do know, I guess, how to answer the other question, when we are not covering something that probably should be getting covered.
Yeah, well, I read the Epoch Times all the time, to tell you the truth, and I know who they are and what they're doing, but somehow I just have to soak some of that stuff in and then filter it out.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the time, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Trevor.
I was just gonna say, like, the best way to, combat the disinformation is to understand it yourself. Like, the reason, like, to go to read the Epoch Times or to go to read, Fox News articles or, Daily Wire articles or whatever, or conversely, on the other end of the spectrum, progressive stuff, is to, just get into the mind of the other person and to understand, all right, this is what they're gonna say, this is what they believe, so how am I gonna work around
that? That's a good approach, Trevor.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
I wonder, Dr. Carley, do you have any final thoughts, having heard from all these journalists and sort of how they absorbed what your presentation? Do you have a final mission for us to take forward and out into the world?
So the one thing I would say is that to the extent that it's helpful, if you can partner with some of the local universities and colleges, because they can actually both be supportive and actually may have things that can support you in your work. And so more partnership with the academic communities may be very helpful for both sides. And the other thing is, these are hard problems. No one's come up with great solutions in the past 100 years for a lot of these. And some of the problems we're talking about, started at the start of the modern newspaper, when it first started back when the ships came over with news.
Mhm.
So.
Yeah. No, I think, that seems to be one constant theme I've heard from everyone today. Is just that idea of reconnecting with our communities, reconnecting with people to build up that trust. And like you're saying, getting out of the newsroom and building with partnerships with universities and other organizations makes sense too. So,
if I could add just a little bit, Andy, I think that everyone I reached out to was so amenable to this event, and continuing this partnership. As I said, I discovered a lot of organizations. I knew Melinda from PNA and other people along, but I've discovered so many different people, so many different organizations. And one thing, just to leave you all with, someone suggested to me, is that we have to think about supporters of journalism as well as our own professional groups and academics and actual practitioners. There are a lot of people out there who believe in us, our philanthropists, our foundations, community groups, and that's something we'll talk about in the next session. So I hope to see, thank you for hanging in here, all of you, and Andy will wrap this up, but I'm so looking forward to the NewsGuard report next week. And thank you all for coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Carley, for the presentation and for being here. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
And I put a couple of things in the chat. Next week is PA Sunshine Week. So hopefully the spring will continue to be here. And there's actually an event on Tuesday morning. I put the link in there, sponsored by the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And then the Center for Media Innovation, the place where I work, is we're giving away a fellowship for up to $20,000 for local journalism. It can be anywhere in the United States. So those of you who are across the state, we'd love to hear from you. And if you're across the country, we'd love to hear from you too. And if you don't think you can use it yourself, please pass it on to someone who you think you can. But who couldn't use an extra 20 grand for local journalism? And then just lastly, I want to thank all the sponsors and everyone who agreed to help us out with this. Like Helen said, everyone she reached out to was enthusiastic about saying yes, and continue to spread the word. So just a quick thank you to the Lenfest Institute, Thomas Jefferson University, PA NewsMedia Association, the Press Club of Western Pennsylvania, and of course the CMI. So thanks everyone, and we will see you next Tuesday.
Great, thanks very much.
Have a good day.
See everyone. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.